So now we will turn to Olaf Guenther, who's at the University of Leipzig Institute of Anthropology, and he will be talking on alfalfa entangled stories from the Aral Sea.
Yeah, hello again, and thank you for having me today. Differently to Daniel, I'm not talking about research or recent research. I just want to deliver some stories from the Aral Sea. When we were thinking about the workshop, I thought that might be interesting, but it is not. I'm not too deep as Daniel is in ongoing questions on herbs and medical plants that I will deliver to you. It's just some stories. Okay, I share my screen and begin with a story. So the Aral Sea region was for me as a landscape for a long time, just a lake that cannot go outside anymore. So there is no flow anymore. So it ends in the steppes. The Germans have the term for it, Steppenendsee. I don't think that the end in the steppe sea lake would match it, but for a long time, the climatological concept of the Aral Sea was there is water coming from the mountains and going into the desert. But actually, this is not the fully truth, because with the Aral Sea crisis, different stories came into the discussion, and so we have two contrasting concepts of the understanding of the nature of the Aral Sea and also the Caspian Sea. So one of it is that what I already told to you, everybody thinks that the Aral Sea is the end of the drainage system from the mountains, and it is knowingly excluding the subterranean connection. And on the other hand, the subterranean connection was already proved in the mid of the 19th century from scientists on an expedition going there and through barometric leveling could prove that there is a connection between these two lakes. So the Aral Sea region, from the climatological background, would look like this. This is not the thickness of rivers, but the amount of waters that flows in from the mountains into the lowlands. And you see the biggest amount of water is used along the river, and very few is coming to the Aral Sea. A bit more is coming here from the Syrdarya and to the north of the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan, because the building of a dam right here was rescuing a very little part of the Aral Sea, but the other part is dry, as you know. So on the other hand, there is a called a geological concept that declares that there is a connection between Caspian Sea and Aral Sea, and that there is some very complicated geological subground that brings water from the Aral Sea to the Caspian Sea and water from the Caspian Sea to the Aral Sea. In certain decades, in certain centuries, it is as I say, in an asynchronic shape. So if the Caspian Sea is getting smaller, the Aral Sea is getting bigger, and vice versa. This is something we can prove from sources since the 16th century. So this is what the people remember going there and talking about the shape of both the Aral Sea and the Caspian Sea. I'm only bringing this to you as a introduction into the Aral Sea region. So if anybody thinks that everything is clear about the Aral Sea, it is still something that is under discussion. This discussion leads me to the plants. No. The history of the landscape is also, of course, shaped by the colonial powers. So the for the historical introduction, until the 1920s, the agricultural used region was split into two parts: the left bank or the western bank of the Amudarya River was state territory of the Khanate of Khiva, and the right side, the right bank, the eastern bank, was integrated into the Russian dominion or the Russian territories in 1873. And the story that I will tell you about the alfalfa begins actually here. So that is the right bank of the Amudarya River, and this is the city of Čimbaj, one of the larger cities in the Amudarya Delta region. So around 1905 and 1906, the fodder plant alfalfa, which is also known as Lucerne, was introduced from the Russian agricultural territories to Čimbaj, and it offered there some, by many ways, ideal conditions. First, the population around Čimbaj is semi-nomadic, or Karakapak would not consider them as being nomadic, but somehow more mobile. So they have an agriculture that is, they had an agriculture, we have to say, that was standing on three pillars. One was fishery, so they used the water and the fish in the rivers for Turkic people, quite a rare example, because many Turkic people would not use fish at all. Then the second pillar was, of course, agriculture from the acre, from the soil. So this was a bit more complicated because the soil was very often flooded by water from the Amudarya, and so you had to change constantly your territory for if you wanted to have some soil agriculture. And the third one is an agriculture used with livestock, but the livestock was not as the livestock we know from other nomadic people like camel and sheep and goat, because these three species can walk a lot, but it was more standing on cow, and cow is not a herding animal that can walk long distances. So with a cow you can even not do 30 kilometers. You would bring back home a skeleton without meat. So the nomadism of the Karakalpak people was less mobile than these from the Kazakh tribes, for instance, or the Kazakh communities. So a fodder plant met a very, very big need of these Karakalpak agriculturalists, because it helped to be less mobile. Because less mobile was better for their economy, because then they could would not lose so much energy in mobile mobility, and the livestock would get fatter and so on and so on. So the seed introduced from Russia was greeted on with a big demand, and soon it became more than people even could consume in the regions. So just to say something on the plant, it is called Medicago sativa, and it is actually cultivated worldwide, and it is said that this plant comes out of Central Asia itself, and was wandering by natural and human impact already since many centuries or thousands of years. So the Egyptians knew the alfalfa, and the Persians have it in their script and also in their use. So the globalization of the plant was actually beginning somehow thousands of years ago, and it is very useful plant because they have in the root bacteria that make it possible to take nitrogen not only from the soil but also from the air. So you can grow this kind of plant in a region where is very low fertility or nutrient poor soils. So that's why it can spread. Actually, if somebody of you has sheep and goat, then they know that the fodder plant is actually not the sweetest thing for the animals. So they only eat it if there is nothing else left. So although we speak about the success of the fodder plant out of the eyes of the goat or a sheep, it is something, the last thing that would like to eat before starving, but at least they eat it. Yeah, you can make a little trick with microorganisms to make it more soft, and then you pack it into packages, and then it is better for the cows, for instance, to eat. Yeah. So alfalfa was coming out of the region already 5-6 years after the introduction by boats that were harvesting the plant in the whole area, and then brought it to the bigger ports. One of the bigger ports is the Xoğejli, and they have the canal. You know, the Amudarya region is full of channels, and they were used until the 1960s in many ways. So this is a picture not from the 19th century, but something 1960, and this was canals that would have a very big infrastructure in the Amudarya region. But from Xoğejli, they were shipped then through the Aral Sea, and then were taken to the Trans-Siberian Railway, and already also this plant was sold in the US until the 1920s. So the fodder was so successful, and the commodity chains were in such a good shape, I would say, or in a shape that would function, that some agricultural product from the Aral Sea region, at that time also very remote, were coming into European and American markets. If we look onto these two narratives, one is the alfalfa coming naturally into the regions that we call Egypt or Persian, and the other narrative is the globalized modern narrative. We see that there is actually two, not contradictions, but two competing narratives. So one is spreading through the wind and seed transport. You know how seed transport is functioning. Birds are eating something, and then they fly, and then they rest, and then they leave something with their rest, and the new plant is growing. So seeds can be transported in many ways, but of course also by human all time, as Daniel would probably also support. People were having little sacks of seeds with them when they traveled, just to make an exchange to other seeds and so on. So seed transport was, I think, something very, very, very old. And as we know from the spreading of the agricultural idea, that it was not spreading with people, but spreading with packages. So people were bringing this agricultural idea, all over, I would say, Eurasia. The other narrative begins in 95 and is over in 1920s. Right here at the end of the 1930s, but that's actually not true. It was already in the end of the 1920s that the Russian-American trade was going over. But this narrative is short-term, covers just 20 years, and is standing against this silent history of seed transport by birds in the long durée. But, and that is the interesting point, it is more successful. So people know much more details about these 15 years or 20 years of alfalfa trade from the Aral Sea region than they would know from the spreading of the plant during time and space before modernization. So we have two narratives. One is speaking out of the plant. So nobody tells us about these 5,000 years except the plant itself. And the other is our historians like Askar Jumashev from this Academy of Science in Nukus, Karachi, Pakistan, who would have a lot of small details on the alfalfa trade. So this is the first part of my stories. Second part of my stories is a bit more modern. It is going about licorice or lakritsa, like the Russian would say. I would take only 5 minutes. Yes. Okay. So lakritsa is a very, very widespread plant in the Aral Sea region. It is growing also on the east bank, so on the right side of the region, and is having a large amount of territory where it is growing. Licorice is very good for soil salinity. So it where this plant is growing, making out of the air a sweet root, and you would use this sweet root for many uses. It transfers the soil from saline into also more sweet. So it is actually, licorice is actually a solution for the locals to cope with the problems they have in the area. So one of the problem is that the agriculture actually works best with channels. One channel for bringing the sweet water into the area and one channel for taking out the rubbish water out of the area. So first you have to wash the acre, and then you can use sweet water for growing plants. So actually in the region to use agriculture, you have to use the water twice. First you wash and then you sow. And the other is that most of these channels in the last 30, 40 years are out of order, are not functioning anymore. And licorice is something that rehabilitates the soil without this water, and it's actually a good solution for the region to be grown. The only problem is it is a wild plant, so you cannot use it as efficiently in agriculture as you would find it in the landscape, and that is also how it is harvested. So now 20,000 square kilometers of licorice are harvested by Karachi companies. Looking into the yellow pages of Karachi, Pakistan, I found just 6 to 7, some based in Nukus, some based in Tashkent, that would work on licorice, and it is not only sold to China, but also produced in pharmacies in Uzbekistan to sell it. And how it is harvested here, you can see. So people who harvest it have a big impact on the landscape. It is harvested in tons, and only the demand of licorice in the last 20 years from China was growing with 30%. So if somebody began this investment in 2008, he would have it more than double probably in the last 12 to 13 years. Now, before there were in the Soviet Union, there were of course also people that would use the Aral Lakritsa and sold it in a Soviet market, or also to people outside the Soviet Union. So one of the importers of Russian licorice, so to say, is a West German company called Wolfgang Bauer Company, and they buy as much as possible. But now, as my Kara Kapak friends I asked about the licorices would say, the biggest part is going to China. Before I end with my stories, I just walk you through homepage of one of these global leaders of licorice trade. This is an American company called Mafco. They buy in a large extent raw materials all over the world. And one thing they are very successful with is licorice, of course, because licorice is a natural sweet, and differently to other sweets that we have in the markets, it's not known as so harmful. So yeah, the story of this company begins in 1850, as you can see. So they have on their homepage a very nice time line, and you see it begins with the business being established in Turkey, and some years or afterwards already they go to Bulgaria. So they spread around the Black Sea, and then they would ship these things. They would buy ordered in the late 19th century to the US and build factories there to extract the sweetness. And you can see not much happens until 1970s. So the market on sweets got a boom on the boost. People are demanding more and more sweets, and you can see it's going step by step, year by decade they are growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and now they are probably one of the biggest licorice importing companies of the world, not beating one investor in China, in Shanghai. He has even published a book. You can easily Google it if you Google licorice and Shanghai. You will find a book, manual how to sell your own licorice to this Shanghai shipping company. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and that's actually all of my stories that I could tell you. Okay, I tried to stop.
Hey,
so I'm happy for every question, and I hope that I can answer some of them.
Well, I just first have a short clarification question. I don't know if I missed this, but what is the interrelation of alfalfa and licorice in the Aral Sea region?
The story of the alfalfa is over, so there is no more soil that could be used for the growing of this plant because the droughts in the last 50 years are so heavy, and the water is so expensive for agriculture that you think twice if you would use it for growing of alfalfa. But licorice does not need any kind of agricultural help. You have it on a large area, and it's, I would say, licorice is a new alfalfa. So if alfalfa only got me to the question of how globalized was the world already in the end of the 19th century, then licorice gets me to the question how this story actually ends or is going into the future, because yeah, it's something new from seen as with Chinese eyes. I would say something new because only in the beginning of the 2000s they would begin to import licorice in a larger amount than before.
And I have also, it sounds like this is an interesting story about kind of relationality between different plants and nodules. And so I actually wanted to ask you if you, in the story of the agency of the alfalfa, if that is actually an agency of the nodules of the alfalfa more so than the alfalfa itself. Because it sounds like from the way you described it that the alfalfa spreads well through the fact that it has these nodules that allow it to enter into new areas easily.
Yeah, I would say these are two stories actually that are entangled and also not entangled. So one, the natural spreading of alfalfa means, of course, that everybody knows this product in the world and it's easier to sell. So the market is already open, except you would introduce a totally new fodder plant. Nobody knows in the world and nobody would know how to use it. So of course, these two stories are entangled. One story of the natural transportation of the seed is somehow very silent, and the other, the modern story, is somehow very loud, and it has its yeah, it has its somebody from the German-speaking community should get amplifier, a Verstärker, an amplifier is somehow, the globalization is an amplifier of the story. Although the other story of the long durée is actually more charming.
Would anyone like to ask a question? Sayana?
Actually, it's a kind of small comment, because when Olaf were talking about that alfalfa was introduced to the region from other part of the colonized empire, let's say, expanding that time rapidly, I was thinking that maybe the plants were kind of also very very useful tool for the internal colonization. When you kind of, instead of after you grab the territory, you kind of try to digest it. And I know that there is a term, internal colonization, for this kind of practices. And it seems to me that plants in this case are very kind of agency is used by the state to kind of reaffirm its politics, and it's kind of to reproduce itself through the plants.
Sayana, you are totally right, and I would like to introduce another plant we not spoke yet about, but probably everybody knows it. Cotton was also introduced in the same time, but it was not treated at all in the same amount because it was seen surely as a cash crop. So nobody could eat it, nobody could use it in such high amounts in the internal market. So it was already seen at that time as something that would make the region dependent to Russia. And also many riots in the 1920s was against this cash cropping, and they said rice is better than cotton. So many of the peasants did not want to grow cotton, but from alfalfa we don't know the same story, because it met the demand of the people at the same time. So it was actually if plants and colonization are also somehow communicators, so alfalfa was a better communicator of colonization from the Russian perspective than it was the cotton.